As Robin said, I'm the director of the Mongolian Research Center for Buddhist Languages, which is located a couple of doors down, and it is the organizer for this panel discussion. We actually had planned this panel discussion before we even knew that there was a Bay Area Books Festival, but once we realized that the two coincided with each other in time, it seemed natural to bring them together. And of course, we're delighted that so many of you are interested. The four of us and some of the people in the audience have been attending a 4-day conference on mindfulness and compassion at San Francisco State University. And so our heads are full of thoughts and ideas in addition to whatever our personal practice is and our personal interest. And it's a great thing that we have the chance to share some of those ideas with you. Mindfulness is a boom. It's a boom industry. People are talking about it, acting on it, applying it, and for those of us who've been in the Buddhist tradition, practicing for many years, it's still a little hard to wrap our heads around that. Suddenly, this is just a very hot topic. With that development, certain kinds of issues come to the fore. We need to ask what happens as mindfulness becomes a kind of mainstream commodity, and I suppose I'm using the word commodity advisedly here. We need to ask, what is that doing to the way that Buddhism is making its way in the West? And so when we talk about beyond mindfulness, it's really looking at that question. Can we step back and take a look and see what is really going on with this sudden new transmission of mindfulness, as in some ways, as one of the speakers in one of our conferences said, referring to an ancient text, the white panacea, the answer to everything that ails you. There are benefits and there are also dangers, and that's some of what we're going to be discussing. So we're going to start off with some poetry. Gary Gack, who is sitting at the far end here, to my left, your right, is a poet of some note. He is also the author of a book called The Complete Idiot's Guide to Buddhism. I must say I wasn't so thrilled about that title, Gary. But it sells books, I guess, and it's a good book. And it's for sale out here somewhere. Gary's going to read some poetry and also talk a little bit to get us started. Thanks.
Thank you, Jack. Can you hear me? Am I speaking too close? Right. This is good. It is an honor indeed, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to start with a pledge. It's by the Japanese-American poet Lawson Fusao Inaba. This is from the book, it's over at the Parallax Table, which is by Eastman, called What Book? It's an anthology of poems influenced by the Buddha from 1950 to today, but they're by also people who are not Buddhists. Do you know the difference between a Buddhist and a non-Buddhist? Non-Buddhists think there's a difference. This is a call and response kind of a poem. It's, what do they say, calling and hollering. I'll read a line and then I'll say it again and you can repeat it with me. Pledge. Repeat after me. I do, you, we, be. Repeat as necessary. And there's one more from the selection of his that I'll read. It's called Just Made It. I look at the tree as if I had just made it. I count the leaves. When I included his poems, he wondered how I knew that they were Buddhist poems that he wrote when he was ordained. He's Japanese-American, but he ordained in a Tibetan lineage. There's something about him doing this book where I was able to just see into the heart of this commonality of mindfulness. It goes beyond Buddhism, or Buddhism is beyond, what's the difference? And I'll just sort of give you a quick outline of some of the thoughts that I've had over this yeasty weekend by speaking through poems, because they're shorter and they go beyond words. The next one is by David White, who you may have heard, this Irish-American poet, healer, teacher. It's called Enough. These few words are enough. If not these words, this breath. If not this breath, this sitting here. This opening to the life we have refused again and again. Until now. Until now. Until now. Repeat as necessary. This is by a Tibetan who translated for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he moved to Alaska because he loved the snow like his homeland. His name is Noda Paljor, and he refers to a poem you may not know. It's called Stopping by the Woods in a Snowy Evening. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have miles to go before I sleep. I have promises to keep. He has obligations. And I'm reading it because it brings out a kind of there is a certain qualitative difference between our society as it is and another way of being and putting things together, of living, which is, I think, why I have taken on the path. Robert Frost and I have one thing in common. He loves woods, and so do I. But there seems to be a big difference in the way we set forth in life's journey. He is a goer, and I am a sitter. He has miles and miles to go before he sleeps, while I have years and years to sit to reach the same destination. This is by a Trinidadian, Caribbean poet, Derek Walcott. And he's perfectly happy to be in this anthology of poems influenced by the Buddha. He's Caribbean, he's hardly Buddhist. And it's a poem called Love After Love. And I think what the title means is that you have come to a point in life where love no longer means I wanna, we've got to, and all the societal senses of romance. And now you really understand true love, and love begins with being kind to ourselves. True love, it begins with, we can't be capable of loving another if we can't love ourselves. So it's about that self-compassion that you might hear of. Love after love. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, sit here, eat. You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your own image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life. Now, I'm going to read two more and then I'm done. This is by Patricia Donegan, and it's like now for something completely different. And I'm bringing this into this context so that we can listen to it mindfully without judging and hear what she has to say. Checkup. Tibetan lamas say the worst thing you can do to break your vow is to rape your mother at noon on an altar during her period when she's a nun, nobly born and a relative of your guru. No, I didn't do that. But neither did I look the homeless woman in the eye, as sure as I gaze at these stars. And let's see, one more. Okay. This book, the great poem in this book, by the way, I'm not going to read it now. My teacher is Thich Nhat Hanh, and it's called Please Call Me by My True Names. If you haven't heard it, maybe afterwards if there's time. I'll read one by another teacher of mine named Lou Welch, who was a associate of Gary Snyder and those people. Yeah.
Louder, please.
Okay, I thank you for reminding me. Is this okay?
Better.
Better?
Yeah.
How's this? Okay. I saw myself, a ring of bone, in the clear stream of all of it, and vowed always to be open to it, that all of it might flow through, and then heard, ring of bone, where ring is what a bell does. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Lisa Dale Miller. Oh, is Dave going to go next?
That's what I hear.
Okay, that's right. Yours from over there. Okay, very good. Our next speaker is David McMahon. David teaches at Franklin and Marshall College on the East Coast. He is interested, he's trained in Buddhist history, but he has been developing a specialty for some years now in the modern development or the encounter of Buddhism with modernity. And among his books is one that is very well known in the community of people who are interested in this and has had a big impact on the field, The Making of Buddhist Modernism. David?
I expected like 4 or 5 people to be here. Well, since I know that after being sort of transported to the border of language itself by these blissful poems, what everybody wants after that is to hear some history. I'll try not to make it terribly boring. What I'd like to do is just to briefly sort of contextualize meditation as it's come to be known in modern North America, and to maybe say some things about the history, and then to indicate some possibilities of where it's going and how it got to be where it is. And it's a fairly interesting history. If you can everybody hear me first of all? Back there? Okay. So I guess again, to try not to be terribly boring, we can begin with burning buildings and soldiers marching through the street. Very meditative scene, right? Burma, late 19th century. The British are blasting their way in and taking over the place. They burned down a Buddhist library. And in response, a very prominent monk named Ledi Sayadaw, he is looking around, and he's a very educated fellow, and he decides at that moment to do something really radical, because he is really concerned that this is a moment in history that could be the end of the Dharma, the end of Buddhism, at least in Burma, if not the world. All these Buddhist-dominated countries are being colonized. The West is coming in. There's a whole narrative of we're the civilized folks, and you guys are the sort of uncouth, primitive savages, and we're going to restructure your society out of our benevolence and displace your religion with ours, and so on. So that's the general mentality. And he said, in the face of this, he thinks, we're going to have to do something radical. That is, we're going to start teaching Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist meditation to the lay people. Now, before that, for most of Buddhist history, with a few exceptions, but as far as we can tell, for a lot of Buddhist history, and certainly up to that point, the 19th, 18th century, meditation was really a pretty narrow practice. It was an elite practice. It was practiced by the monastic community primarily. Very few laity were practicing meditation. And for the laity, it was more rituals, giving to the Sangha, ethical practices, and the general attitude was that meditation was, that was for the monks and nuns. That's not something that we would want to do. It would be kind of arrogant to presume that we would do that. So there's always been a kind of like an MA track and a BA track and a PhD track in Buddhism. Not everybody is like shooting for nirvana and doing these intense meditative practices. A lot of people are just doing sort of ordinary things and trying to be good people and getting good karma for a good rebirth. And so in this context, it was kind of a radical thing for this prominent monk, very learned monk, to start to teach meditation to ordinary Buddhists, and to start to try to figure out how to get good, Buddhist philosophy out to these folks. So that really is the origins of the modern iteration of meditation. Of course, it goes way back before that to ancient India, 2,600 years ago. And also a very radical move when these countercultural folks decided to basically renounce their mainstream culture and leave their families and no longer participate in the sacrifices and form these communities out in the forests of people who were suddenly had this idea that it would be a good idea to sort of look inside the mind and to try and find what's going on in there and how sort of a radical restructuring of the mind might overcome this fundamental problem of suffering. And so that started a kind of revolution and a whole new way of thinking and living in ancient India that then, of course, spread to China, to Tibet, to Japan, and Southeast Asia, and now, in the last 100, 150 years or so, has come to North America. So, after Ledi Sayadaw started to teach meditation, he started to set up, he and his associates started to set up meditation centers, which is a new kind of thing. There were temples where people would go to pray and burn incense, honor their deceased relatives. There were monasteries where people would do various kinds of training for becoming a priest or becoming a monk or a nun, and there would be some meditation that went on there. But this was a new kind of thing, meditation center, where anybody could come and learn these meditative techniques that previously had been sort of behind the monastic walls, behind the monastery walls. And so this began to proliferate and to spread throughout Southeast Asia. And this is the origin of the Vipassana movement, or the insight meditation movement, which is very popular all over the world now. And meanwhile, Japanese Zen folks were starting to get the same idea, and were starting to rethink, again, rethinking their traditions, not because they just suddenly decided to do it, but because there was an immense political, social pressure. The colonial pressure, the hegemonic power of Western, of Europe. And so meditation really arose out of that time of conflict, or at least the modern popular meditation, lay meditation. The other sort of, I think another sort of couple of pivotal moves in the mid-20th century is when Westerners first started to, before the 20th century actually, it didn't just start in mid-20th century, but in the mid-20th century there were a few books written by Westerners who started to describe meditation in sort of scientific terms. Meditation is doing for the mind what the scientists are doing to empirical reality. There's sort of parallelism set up there. And so that sort of got people thinking about meditation in those terms. And meanwhile, the Vipassana movement had spread and began to filter into North America. And I think one of the key moves in, again, thinking about where did meditation as we encounter it today in the YMCA, or where the many places, your therapist's office or your cardiologist's office, or any number of places where you can encounter today. Where did it come from, and how did it get to be like that? The very famous Vipassana teacher S.N. Goenka, who recently died, began to describe meditation in very secular terms. He insisted this is not a religious practice. It's not even really a Buddhist practice, he said. The Buddha himself wasn't even really a Buddhist. There was a Buddhist religion that sort of came afterwards, but these practices have always been just what they were. They were not the exclusive property of any religion. And so he began to talk about meditation like this and to teach it like this. And even though there was still a lot of sort of religion in the background of what he did, this was another step towards bringing meditation sort of out, not only from behind the monastery walls, but really beyond the borders of Buddhism itself. Because this is another thing that he claimed, is that you don't have to be a Buddhist to practice this. The early Lady Sayadaw was still sort of focused on the Buddhist community. But Goenka said, let's just bring this, if you're a Christian, it's okay, you can do this too. And so meditation started to filter into more people's lives. And I think another pivotal move was in the last few decades when, there started to emerge a more concerted effort to study meditation scientifically, and machines to do that. People more recently started to stick monks into MRI machines to see what their brains were doing. And the popular press has sort of hyped a lot of that research, and it's become very popular. And also, there were key figures like John Kabat-Zinn, for instance, who took Vipassana meditation and Zen meditation and really tried to secularize it and to strip away a lot of, really all of the Buddhist language. And keep in mind, this is in an American context. He's a medical clinician, and he is negotiating not just sort of abstract categories of religious and secular, but actual laws. There are legal consequences. You can't just go into a public university, say, and say, well, I'm going to have you guys do Buddhist meditation any more than you wouldn't have somebody take communion or something because you thought it might be helpful to their recovery or something. So this is really where we get the beginnings of an attempt to secularize meditation practice. So from there, we now, in the past couple decades, have just seen the proliferation of meditation, often in the what's called mindfulness. John Kabat-Zinn's program is called mindfulness-based stress reduction, and it's done in hospitals. It's done in public universities. There are programs that teach it in public universities. There are programs in large corporations. There are programs at Google. There are programs at Goldman Sachs. There are programs in the U.S. military, mindfulness programs in the military. So now this brings up, I think in the last couple of years, there's been what some people have called a kind of backlash. Like suddenly people are pausing and saying, wow, wait a minute, is this what mindfulness was about? Is it being used to help train people to kill? Is it being used to help train people to just, rake in more money for big corporations? And so these are some of the debates that have emerged now, rather recently, around the mindfulness movement. Has too much of the Buddhism been stripped away? Some people who are deeply invested in the Buddhist tradition are saying, look, where's the Buddhism in this? This was supposed to be a practice that fundamentally helps people overcome what are in Buddhism sometimes called the three poisons: hatred, greed, and ignorance. So is that the way they're being used? So I guess I've sort of used my time here. So in putting this into a historical context and providing a little bit of quick narrative, I just sort of wanted to think about where meditation has been, where it's going, and I think one of the most prominent places we find it is in clinical practice, where there are just almost undoubted benefits that it's been bringing to many people. And so, again, how do you weigh these undeniable benefits that it can bring to people who don't necessarily, have a big commitment to Buddhism or its larger ethical principles, with this issue of what's the broader context? What are the power relationships involved? What is mindfulness being used for? And so I think this would be a good time to transition then to Lisa, who herself is a clinical practitioner who uses this practice. Thank you.
So as David said, Lisa Dale Miller is a psychotherapist in private practice in Los Gatos, here in the Bay Area. And she's the author of a book called Effortless Mindfulness. And she stresses in her practice, or not a good word to use in mindfulness. She emphasizes in her practice the somatic dimensions of mindfulness and mindfulness training.
Thank you. I was sitting here listening to David, and as Jack has said, we've just had 3 days of, I can't even begin to tell you how full and rich we all feel listening to colleagues of ours in varying disciplines, speaking to the issues that David brought up. I was one of the clinicians speaking to the issue of the way that the mindfulness practices are being delivered as interventions in the psychotherapeutic and medical community. And as I was listening to David, I suddenly had this very powerful realization that the reason I wrote my book, which is a textbook actually for clinicians, it's a full distillation on the actual Buddhist teachings, all 3 yanas, which has never been written up until now. And it's dense, that's the word I hear about it most. So it's not a quick read. But it also really lays out the actual practices as they are taught in the various Buddhist schools, and not the stripped down versions that my psychotherapeutic colleagues are being handed. And I was sitting here and I was thinking, I'm having deja vu. And the deja vu which I will share with you is, I met Maharishi Mahesh Yogi when I was 14 in the early 70s. And by the time I was 15, I was doing resonance courses. So I was already doing retreat. By 16, I'd done my first month-long retreat, and pretty much every year was doing 2-month retreats. And I was a witness to watching how the TM movement, when I started TM back then, we were listening to videotapes of Maharishi lecturing on God consciousness, unity consciousness, and I mean, it was the real Vedic knowledge. And in about 3 years' time, suddenly science started to take over. And Maharishi was very interested in science, and it was very beautiful. We were all very happy because people like my father, who had 3 heart attacks by the time he was 42, was meditating because it was science. But I watched the knowledge get lost in the TM movement. And I was just sitting here listening to you and suddenly realizing that the impulse for me to write this book was because as a clinician, I was so tired of receiving in my mailbox these pamphlets that would say 2-hour workshop on mindfulness, and then you can go and you can teach mindfulness, and I had had enough. And I didn't set out to write a book. Routledge actually asked me if I would consider writing a book for them. But I'd already been asked by 2 publishers before that if I would write a book for them. And I'd never written a book before, so it seemed kind of silly. But I told them, each of them, I wanted to write the actual Buddhist teachings, and they said, well, that's not psychology, but Routledge was totally into it, amazingly enough. And when I got the email from them, I just sent it back and said, this is what I want to do, only call me if you're interested in that. So sometimes when I talk about my book, because it is a clinical manual, it is kind of scholarly, most people, regular people won't read it. It's not one of those popular mindfulness books. Sometimes I read out of it, so I thought that I would just read 2 short sections. Would that be okay with everyone?
Sure.
Actually, I'm just going to read from the first page, and it pretty much lays out why I wrote this. Most mental health professionals find themselves working with people who appear to be hapless, captive passengers in their own untamed minds, with no idea how to drive the vehicle of mind toward its own innate tranquility and clarity. So it makes sense that mindfulness, which cultivates a calm, clear mind, is now widely recognized as an integral part of effective treatment for a variety of mental health maladies. Yet mindfulness is often trivialized or conflated with other interventions. Coincident with the popularization of clinical mindfulness has been a movement to make mindfulness, in quotes, more accessible to everyone by separating it from its, in quotes, Buddhist roots. There are clinicians, myself included, who consider this effort unnecessary because these Buddhist roots have always been a philosophy, psychology of mind, that is, at its core, secular and research-oriented. Furthermore, mindfulness is just one of many beneficial tools contained within the profound Buddhist toolbox for awakening. Most of these tools, including mindfulness, have yet to be fully explored. This book was born from a desire to ignite interest in reuniting clinical mindfulness with its source, Buddhist psychology and philosophy, and in so doing, to return mindfulness psychotherapy to its primary function as the supreme method for liberating mind from primordial ignorance. So that is how my book starts. And by the time you're at almost the last chapter, which is called Nirvana as Skillful Action and Transformation, this is the point at which now that you've had pages and pages of teachings and neuroscience and biophysical science, now I basically lay down the line about what this method is actually about. And I don't think you'll hear this if you go for a mindfulness-based intervention. Buddhist psychology proposes to decrease the mass of human suffering by seeding the world with quiescent, wise, and compassionate people who move through their lives awakened and present to suffering and non-suffering. I imagine that many mental health clinicians resonate with that vision and believe their work aligns with similar objectives. So what makes Buddhist psychology different? The Buddha asserted that liberation comes from seeking unconventional truth, the unconditioned existential awareness of our innermost beingness. Since unconditioned beingness is devoid of self-reified narratives and personal transpersonal identities, it is beyond all conceptualizations. It cannot be arrived at through psychodynamic, content-driven, narrative-focused, or conceptually based psychotherapeutic methods. A Buddhist psychological approach would have to offer something more. Envisage an inner pilgrimage designed to strip away the habitual conventionality of selfing, a form of psychotherapeutic inquiry that encourages the self to deliberately, fearlessly interact with the unconventional truth of its own emptiness. That inner pilgrimage would likely consist of interventions aimed at exposing the self's utter transparency, an insight-driven process of not finding as the ultimate finding. If not finding elicits a sense of discomfort or inconceivability, see whether you can know the phenomenality of that uneasiness. As you do this, try to find a self existing apart from the discomfort. You may experience the feeling of an unidentifiable self or the thought of a self, but an actual, separately existing self-identity can never be found. That is emptiness. Anam Thupten says, if you can make friends with emptiness, it will lead you to unconventional truth, the ultimate truth, the truth of who you are, your original face, which is limitless. You will lose all your ideas of who you are, guilt, pride, and doubt. That is liberation. And that liberation is the heart of Buddhist psychology. And that is why I wrote this book, as a deep offering and a gift to my colleagues who spend their days doing such incredible work to heal the suffering of the people that they work with. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I want already said a little bit about myself. I'm Jack Petranker. The qualification for being up here was that we were authors. The book that I recently published is called Inside Knowledge. And it is not couched so much in terms of mindfulness, but I think it addresses many of the same themes. And in particular, the approach that Lisa was just talking about, I think there's a lot of convergence there. So when I've talked about mindfulness on a couple of occasions before groups that are Buddhist meditation groups, I have generally found, a lot of people, one of the people who spoke at the conference these last few days has said that if you're in a traditional Buddhist practice and you say, well, these people who are doing mindfulness-based stress reduction or something like that, what they're doing isn't exactly Buddhist, so we don't have to pay too much attention. She said, you're making a mistake because in 5 years or 10 years, when you walk into a meditation center, 90% of the people that you meet will have encountered meditation for the first time through a mindfulness-based intervention, and that will be their understanding of what meditation is. So we need to really think hard about the impact that that kind of a development is happening. So when I've met people who come out of that background, there is a general tendency to say, to be, well, I don't want to say defensive. Let me just say, there's a tendency to say, you don't really understand what mindfulness-based intervention is about. And some of you in this audience may be thinking that right now. They say, yes, our focus is on a particular practice of mindfulness, and we don't so much focus on traditional Buddhist practices, but those kind of come along. You get them at no extra cost when you do mindfulness. And John Kabat-Zinn himself, whose name comes up a lot nowadays in these discussions, and he's become a very polarizing figure. A lot of people really, well, I think almost everybody appreciates what he's done because he's made this method of mindfulness available to people, and it's been beneficial to tens or hundreds of thousands of people. So how could you not be pleased with that? But at the same time, people say, yeah, but is something being left out? And we heard his name referenced a lot during this conference, and he's written a lot, so he says different things. And you can argue about exactly what he has in mind. But he said, the practice of mindfulness, he said, when I talk about mindfulness, I'm really using it as a kind of stand-in for the entire Buddhist tradition, for the Buddha Dharma, as we say. And so, really, I'm not leaving out anything about Buddhism. At least that's his intention. But the difficulty that comes up is whether you really can take it for granted that in practicing mindfulness, you're going to be able to really gain access, let's say, to the entire Buddhist tradition. So I'm going to introduce just a little bit of Buddhist terminology to try to clarify that point. Traditionally, if you're going to be a Dharma practitioner, a student of Buddhism, there are 3 trainings that you undergo. You train yourself in 3 distinct ways, and of course they all support one another. The first of them is Shila. I'm giving the Sanskrit terms now, but the Pali is very similar for those of you who care about those things. Shila, which is a kind of moral conduct or ethical conduct or behavior. And then the second one is meditation. And for our purposes, and for the purposes of the mindfulness movement, I think, you can say that mindfulness represents meditation. There are many, many different kinds of meditation, but they all have to do with training the mind or cultivating the mind or cultivating insight. So let's say that that's the second one. And then the third is prajna, which is translated as wisdom or insight. And so if you say mindfulness includes the entire Buddha Dharma, you're saying that ethical conduct comes along when you practice mindfulness, and insight or wisdom comes along when you practice mindfulness. That simply in the act of practicing mindfulness, you develop greater insight and you develop a different way of interacting with the people that you encounter in your life, or perhaps interacting with or taking responsibility for your situation in life and for issues, the kinds of issues that we're very concerned with these days, such as sustainability. So that's the claim that's being made. Now the question is, can you get there from here? Can you get from mindfulness to those elements? And there's been a lot of discussion in the literature, as David was saying, in the last few years, about whether mindfulness really does involve ethical conduct. And very often the point is made, and this came up I think in David's talk and a little bit in the introduction, that it's difficult to say that because mindfulness is now being used in so many different contexts. It's being used in businesses, and it's being used in the military. We've all heard about these different uses. And so I think a wonderful example that became more clear to me during the course of the conference, a couple of people referred to it, was that there are programs for training stockbrokers or traders on the markets in mindfulness, and they're very specifically focused. The idea is that if you become more mindful, more attent, you'll be able to make trades more quickly. Because you'll have a kind of global awareness of things that are going on. So you'll just become a better trader in this very limited, very precise way. And so when you look at those examples, you say, well, what does that have to do with ethical conduct? Or how is that going to lead you to ethical conduct? Now, there's an argument to be made that it will tend to go in that direction, because if the mind calms down, then the natural tendency of the mind to become, to be kind of agitated and jumpy and stressed out will die down, and you'll start to see things more clearly, and then you have to make a little bit of a leap there, and you say, when you see things more clearly, then you see that it's a good thing to be kind to people. You see that it's a good thing to treat others as you would wish to be treated. So there's the possibility of moving toward ethics, even though we see so many examples now. Another example that came up at the conference is that there's a clothing store in Beverly Hills, I believe, called the Mindful Monk. And they sell men's suits. So you could say, okay, maybe there's some connection, even though there are real grounds for concern or for wondering what's going on there. But what we haven't talked about yet is the third of the three trainings, is the training in wisdom. And there is so much in the Buddhist tradition about what constitutes insight into the nature of reality. One of the characteristics of the Buddha, one of the ways in which he's described, is that when he became enlightened, he saw things as they are. And he saw things, the rest of us do not see things as they are. We see our own conceptions of the way things are. But the Buddha saw things as they are, and that's the birth of wisdom. Now the difficulty, and David referred to this, the difficulty with saying, well, let's bring that in. Why not? You know, that sounds like it's a good thing. The difficulty is that when you try to do that, you have to introduce Buddhist teachings. For instance, the teaching of no self. And that's really off limits in most of the contexts in which mindfulness is being presented. You really can't go into a school and say, well, let me explain to you what the Buddha had to say about the nature of the self or about the Four Noble Truths. That whole territory is not available to you. So wisdom tends to get stripped away for practical reasons. Even if you're a practicing Buddhist, you say, well, I can't go there. So the question is there a way in which you could go into or develop the teachings on wisdom or some deeper understanding that takes you more in the direction of seeing the way things are without relying on Buddhist teachings? And it seems to me that there is a shift that you can make that really can go in that direction. And that's something that I've been exploring, and I think that in Inside Knowledge, which is in part a compilation of writing by my teacher, Tarkan Tilku, but it's partly also my little contributions. It seems to me that that's part of what I've been reflecting on. And it actually has become more clear to me during this conference we just came from, how those things go together. The central point in mindfulness practice, as it's traditionally communicated, as it's communicated nowadays, it's not really been around long enough to be traditional, I suppose. The way it's communicated nowadays is purposeful, non-judgmental, present awareness, present-centered awareness. And the question is that really the right center? What if you could expand the center of what's available? And I certainly am not going to try and lay that out too much, but I present it to you as a possibility. What if instead of centering experience in this exact present moment and in the exact experience of this self who is engaged in carrying out meditation practice, what if you could develop more of a mindful field awareness, a kind of an openness to what is going on in every aspect of experience? And that would bring in your own concerns, whether they're based on the past or the future, and it would bring in your own awareness of what's going on without so much concern for your particular role, and it would bring in an openness to the emotions and thoughts and feelings that are constantly cycling through the mind without owning them, without claiming them, and without trying to separate them out as the subject side of experience, and instead looking at the field of experience as a whole. I'm presenting that just as a hypothesis right now, but it seems to me that you really could go in that direction. And if you did, you would be moving in a direction that is at least consistent with the training in wisdom that is so central to the Buddhist tradition. So that's all I'm going to say about that right now. And we've deliberately set this panel up so that we could leave quite a bit of time for discussion. So that's where we are now, is in the discussion part of